Hello everyone, and welcome to the OMC's Mindfulness in the Workplace podcast series. Each of these sessions explores a different aspect of mindfulness in workplace contexts, as well as key themes that we believe will be relevant to support you. Previous episodes have covered mindfulness in a medical setting, delivering mindfulness online, and current research in mindfulness. All podcasts are available on the OMC webpage for listeners to access at a later date. I'm Sharon Hadley, the CEO of the Oxford Mindfulness Centre, and today we're going to be exploring creating a speak-up culture with Megan Reitz. Megan's a Professor of Leadership and Dialogue at Astridge Executive Education, which is part of Hult International Business School. She supervises PhDs working on the Executive Doctorate in Organisational Change and also teaches on a range of other open programmes. Megan's also written a few books, Speaking Up and Mind Time. I'm very delighted to welcome you, Megan. Thank you for joining us today.
Lovely to be here.
Yeah, thank you. We have had several connections over the years on mindfulness and mindfulness in the workplace, and I'm delighted you've offered to do this talk for us today. Could you tell us a little bit about how you've come to where you are yourself? What's your personal story?
Well, my main area that I look at the moment is leadership and I guess communication inside organizations. And I started my career as a management consultant because I didn't really know what else to do. And I sort of focused on strategy, organizational strategy. And I began to notice how it was possible to create a perfect strategy on paper and then offer it to an organization who, sounded very enthusiastic, and then actually implementing that strategy was an entirely different activity. You can create the perfect strategy, but will it work? No. So I began to be very interested in the role of leadership, how organizations change, and what dynamics go on inside organizations that are helpful and what are unhelpful. And I ended, various other points in my career, but then I ended up doing a PhD, which specifically looked at organizational dialogue. And during that, I became, the word is probably obsessed, by how we encounter one another inside organizational systems. So how do we speak, hear, challenge, learn, care for one another inside systems that, really do make it very, very tricky to do all of that well, to be honest. And what is the leadership role within that? And I also began about 20 years ago, with the help of my very dear co-author, a co-researcher, Michael Chaskelson, a very personal interest in mindfulness and mindfulness practice. And then, of course, as my research went on inside organizations, I began to be very interested in, okay, what does mindfulness practice have to say about how we care and encounter and speak and learn from one another inside these systems? So that really brought me to where I am today.
Yeah, fascinating. I mean, there were so many different things you mentioned there that we could go off on and have separate conversations about. I'm particularly interested in your work, Megan. It's fascinating. And I think that the speaking and the culture and mindfulness connect so beautifully. I think that, it's really lovely that you've been able to bring those two things together in your work. Your most recent book looks at or explores creating the speak up culture that's becoming more of a common term, I think, around speaking up in the workplace. Can you tell us a bit more about that and what you've shared in your book for those of us that haven't read it, maybe?
Certainly. So I suppose the way into this is that, you and I and everybody listening to this have habits, lots of habits, but the habits that I'm quite interested in are the habits we have around when we speak up and what we speak up about, and when we stay silent. and also the habits that we have around when we listen, and what we listen to, who we listen to, and whose opinions do we discount, whose voices do we ignore. And actually, we have our individual habits around that, and our teams develop habits around what gets said and what doesn't, and who gets heard and who doesn't. And then, you know, our organizations have cultures, and one way to think of culture is what gets said and what doesn't, who gets heard, who influences, who has the power. And so over the last 7 years with a co-researcher called John Higgins, we've been exploring, well, why do people have the habits that they do? And what are the consequences? And there's been a number of real drivers from an organizational perspective, from a leadership perspective here. And it's been interesting to see how they've shifted actually over 7 years. I'd say when we started the project, which is our project's actually called Speaking Truth to Power. When we started that, we had a lot of interest, particularly from regulated industries and organizations. So, you know, banking, for example, or healthcare, that were very interested in helping people to speak up about compliance issues. You know, Megan, we need those people to speak up when they've made a mistake or when they've seen something that shouldn't be happening. You know, and actually when we started the project was exactly the same time as VW were in the headlines around the emissions scandal. So I think a whole raft of organizations suddenly thought, uh-oh, I might end up on the front page of the newspaper for the wrong reasons here. So how do we get people to speak up? So it started there. And then we entered an age of agility in terms of leadership thinking and practice. And so, you know, you couldn't literally, still probably the case, you couldn't go to a conference on leadership or HR without the word agile being mentioned every other sentence. And, you know, to be agile, to be innovative, you need conversational habits that enable people to speak up with ideas. And perhaps even more tricky than that, you need the habits that enable people to challenge the way things are done. So they need to be able to speak up about that. So the consequences on organizational capacity to innovate and be agile are really intimately connected with what I call conversational habits. And then most recently, we've really thankfully seen a response in terms of diversity and inclusion. So, you know, how do you create inclusive workplaces? Whose voices get heard? Let's get real about this. Let's start talking properly about power and status and authority and what that means for whose voices are heard and whose voices are discounted. And what are the consequences and implications on those people, but also on the organizations that they're part of. These conversational habits, I suppose, they have huge consequences on us as individuals, you know, in terms of our careers, our relationships, and pretty much whether we feel proud of ourselves. And they have big consequences on teams and organizations. So the latest work in the book, Speak Up, is all about those habits and how you begin to recognize them and disrupt them. And actually, the final thing I'll say is, although the book is called Speak Up, it's probably slightly more about listen up. Because one thing we noticed very early on is this tendency that actually we all have at pointing at other people and wondering, you know, why aren't they speaking up? They need to be braver. They need to be more courageous and just speak up. But of course, really people stay silent very often because it isn't a safe environment for them to speak up. So how do we listen? How do we invite people to speak up? And how do we create a workplace culture where you don't have to be so courageous and brave in the first place, So that's the bit that I really, really am getting stuck into and interested in. And that is a leadership role and practice.
Yeah, fascinating. Because the words I was thinking when you were speaking was around courageous and brave, but you're right. There's, it would be nice if the workplaces didn't require you to be courageous and brave, that it was safe, like you say. How can the work around mindfulness support that? And how do those two things support each other to enable that to happen?
So yeah, this is interesting because I started both big research projects at Ashridge around about the same time, 7 years ago. And, you know, as I said, one was called Speaking Truth to Power and the other one was Mindful Leadership. And at the beginning, these two research projects were fairly separate. You know, a few years in, the penny dropped and the two started coming together. So I guess in two main ways. The first is the role of mindfulness in habit change. So with any habits, if you want to stop doing them, it's very helpful to be aware in the moment when you're about to do what you've always done. If you're on autopilot and you are just not here, you will continue to do exactly the same as you've always done. So that capacity to catch oneself in the moment of habit opens up the most amazing thing, and that's choice. The choice in how to respond. And you don't have that choice when you're on autopilot. You only have that choice when you have the capacity to notice and be aware of what is going on in the present moment. And a lot of that research as well came through the mindful leadership work with Michael. And we began to notice, look, one of the key things that is important for leadership is that mindfulness practice enables you to have this awareness in the moment that opens up choice of how to respond to a situation rather than react. And so that's, you know, the sort of overarching thing is, if you want people to speak up, if you want yourself to speak up differently or listen up in different ways, you have to have that level of awareness in the moment so that you can choose, you know, how do I do this to the best of my capacity? And if you don't do that, things will just stay the same. Culture doesn't shift. The other thing I would say is that in our mindful leader research, we came up with a model which we called AIM. And this was derived from coding about, you know, I think it was about 27 hours worth of participant conversations on mindfulness practice and its links to leadership. So we were trying to understand, well, what does mindfulness practice do for leaders? What are they practicing in mindfulness meditations that then proves to be useful in their leadership work? And we identified from the coding, we identified three things. And that was allowing, inquiry, and meta-awareness. Hence, we called it AIM. So allowing is about the capacity to accept present reality. You know, what is the case right now is the case. We may not like it, we may not want it, but here it is. We kind of need to just see that and accept it, rather than using an overwhelming amount of energy wishing it was different, because it isn't. So allowing is that capacity to kind of accept where we're at. And it's also that ability to care and feel compassion towards ourselves and others. Inquiry, fairly obviously, is the ability to be curious and question. And in the workplace, and particularly leaders, can spend an inordinate amount of time advocating, not nearly enough time inquiring. And mindfulness practice, you know, is well, certainly what the practices that we've been using, full of inquiry and curiosity about present moment experience. So question. And then M stands for meta-awareness, which is this ability that that we have through mindfulness practice to have that what's been called intimate detachment, that ability to observe our thoughts, feelings, sensations, and impulses in the moment. So this amazing ability for us to be able to kind of go, ooh, look what I'm thinking, or it's me, look how my body is right now. That's meta awareness. Now, taken together, allowing, inquiring, and meta awareness, those are the three things that then we found opens up this space to respond, which seems so important for leaders. And the work that we've done sort of more recently, we wrote a Harvard Business Review article last year on collective mindfulness or team mindfulness. And this is where it really gets into the territory of creating a speak up culture. So how in our teams are we able to create a culture that is mindful? So in other words, how are we able to allow, stop judging one another quite as much as we usually do, and start caring and feel compassion towards one another in a team? How do we inquire more than just have a fight around advocating our opinions? And how are we able to step out of our own murky team dynamics enough to be able to gain different perspectives? And what we know is that all of those things really are essential if we're going to change the way we speak and listen to one another. So I think, final thing, I drew on a quote by David White, who I'm going to slightly misquote him now, but he essentially says, in order to have a deeper conversation, you need to stop having the one that you're having right now. So in order to be able to create a speak up culture, you've got to stop what you're currently doing and do it differently. And how do you do it differently? Well, you have to be mindful in the moment. You have to be aware.
Thank you, Megan. I mean, there's many things in there that mindfulness teachers will recognize, as general mindfulness, not being able to pause and make a decision and respond and not react. I think the piece that maybe not everybody's done is that connection to how habits, actually impact on what we do, and actually maybe, linking those two, I think has been beautifully done in what you've just said. I wonder if I could come back with a question around the AIM model. I know we've spoken briefly about it before, you and I, but you've not explained it in quite as much detail, and it was really interesting to hear, because one of the words that I find interesting in mindfulness is this word acceptance, and particularly in the workplace, sometimes I'm challenged on that word around, does that then mean if the workplace is not a pleasant place, that we use mindfulness to just accept that's how it is and get on with it? And I can know the listeners won't be able to see, but I can see you shaking your head there. And I wonder what your response to that would be. You're just teaching us mindfulness so that we can accept a really poor practices. Yeah. Would you maybe? Yeah. I'm guessing that's not what you're saying here, but maybe just a tiny bit more on that would be really interesting for me.
Yeah, absolutely not. In fact, it's virtually the opposite to that. We mentioned that in the HBR article as well. So acceptance is around our ability to accept present reality as it is, rather than wish it was different or exert an exceptional amount of energy wishing things weren't as they were. So a classic example I use is around organizational restructures. And I spend a lot of time with managers and leaders who are wishing that the restructure was either not happening or definitely not happening in the way that it currently is. Yeah. And I meet lots of people that are wishing their team wasn't as it was, or wishing that their boss would kind of have some sort of enlightenment moment and start being far more careful and compassionate about how they lead the team. So acceptance is about realizing that at this moment in time, things are what they are. My boss is what my boss is like right now. The restructure is right now happening as it is.
Yeah.
So rather than waste, 90% of my time in an anguished, it's not fair, it shouldn't be, but why it's their faultness, which really is, it's really quite difficult to know how that can be productive, aside from just wearing us down and making us much more anxious and stressed, and probably then that leaking out and making the situation far worse. It's our ability to just say, right, well, it is what it is right now. So therefore, what do I do now to be most productive? And that might be, what can I do now to be most productive in order to shift and change things? Yeah. But leaving behind all of that energy that's engaged with fighting. Yeah. So, but I agree with you. It's a weird concept for people to consider, acceptance or allowing. But that's generally, how I tend to describe it.
Yeah. And that ability to step back and accept may also lead to a looking after oneself, which may be to remove yourself from that organization or that culture. I think that's the other side of what I think we're trying to teach in mindfulness is that, sometimes that's the decision is to look after yourself and maybe make that move, but hopefully not. Hopefully support the organization, the culture to
and that's that's as well as the compassion and the self-compassion aspect, which I think is so important, is if you're finding yourself in a toxic environment, how do you look after yourself? And that may well mean, actually, this is not okay, and I will be making choices that help me to get out of that toxic environment. Having said that, given the work that I do, particularly recently with activism, some people are not in the position to move and shift toxic work environments. So, I really recognize that not everybody feels like they are in a place where they can kind of go, okay, I'll just switch jobs. Okay, I'll go and find another team to work with. That's sometimes not possible as well. That compassion for self and the capacity to read our signals that our mind and body sends us, to treat those seriously and to look after ourselves and know how to do that is also vital.
Yeah, you touched on your activism there. I would like to finish with that, but before we move into that, could I a lot of your work is on mindful leadership, and I'm always interested to hear from people like yourselves who are immersed in one particular area, well, not just one, but leadership being one of your areas. If the listeners to this podcast, a lot of them are teaching in the workplace, a lot of them are being asked to go into work. Some of them are embedded in workplaces already, and some people are being asked, they're mindfulness teachers, and they're being asked to go in as independents into the workplace. So what would you say to the mindfulness teachers that are in the workplace if they have maybe 5 minutes with a leader, a senior leader of a large company, and they have maybe 5 minutes? What would be maybe the 2 or 3 key things that you would say, or you would encourage mindfulness teachers to say if a leader was new to mindfulness or new to kind of the speak up culture? What would be the 1 or 2 kind of nuggets of kind of things that you'd really want to leave as a thought for those leaders when they're considering this approach in the workplace?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it depends where your leader is in terms of, I'm quite used to working with leaders that either know nothing about mindfulness or they have formulated some very interesting views about what mindfulness might be. Generally, they're negative.
Yes, they're exactly the sort of people I'm talking about. So
Okay.
I've heard stuff about mindfulness. What is it, and is it worth? I've got 5 minutes. What is, is it worth me even considering it in the workplace? What are the things that you go, that would really interest leaders to know that? Or
well, I suppose it might be, when I'm running a workshop, I don't start with mindfulness. I start with, what are the leadership capacities that you require in order to lead this organization and team really well?
Yeah.
So what's, in other words, what's on your agenda? And actually, this is some of the research we've done on speaking up as well, is the importance of, start where they are. And our, in our research on mindful leadership specifically investigated resilience, collaboration, and focus and agility. And those three, you'd have trouble finding a leader that didn't agree that those three things are really important and they'd really like to be even better at them. So then once you've got that agreed, I usually then ask them, well, what's your experience with mindfulness? And I also ask them very clearly, come on, give me a best shot. What's all of the images, assumptions, everything that comes to mind when you hear the word mindful?
Yeah.
And I really do encourage them to get out all of the prejudice, all of the, fluffy, connotations that it has with various things. And I get that out, and I don't
in that, Megan. Go on, give us an example of the wild images and things that might come up in that kind of conversation.
Well, I think a lot of people, there's usually what I find comes up is that in terms of connotations, it's connected with yoga or and that whole image, also sort of new age. It can be connected very much with Buddhism, which might work really well with that leader or might not. So those are sort of the images. But then there's also some assumptions that mindfulness is about having a quiet mind, a clear mind. Or as well, what I find very often is mindfulness is simply about focus and attention. That's it. So we'll kind of try and get all that out so that I can bust some of the myths. And I do that not by, I'm very careful to not dismiss the very wide range of mindfulness literature and practice that's helpful to so many people. But I do just say, actually, this is what I mean, and this is what I investigate. And I do link to science and peer-reviewed evidence and data, because that kind of opens ears very often. So data and evidence is still a really important door through which you can then have a conversation about leadership. So it's about saying, what do you want to be even better at, and what do you need to be? Okay, this is what mindfulness is about, and this is what it isn't about. And here's some data and evidence to suggest, and I'm actually, again, very careful with my words, to suggest that mindfulness practice may be a very promising intervention to make in these areas. So what I also don't do is kind of go in cheerleading with a big banner that goes, yay, 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 look, because that in my experience, that just turns people off. And anyway, it's inaccurate. There's still more that we don't know, particularly in the leadership and management field, than we do know. And being open and transparent about that enables you to then go on and have a conversation about, right, what does this mean? What have we done? What's the evidence? How could this work with you? And having the resources that they sort of respect, like the Harvard Business Review articles that enable them to pay more attention to that kind of area. I hope I could talk for ages about this, but I'll pause there.
No, I love that approach, and I think that's really helpful to, to first of all talk about measures that are more familiar to them: resilience, collaboration, agility. So kind of measures that are words or language that workplaces may be more familiar with. And then that approach, and I can really imagine that as a workshop. Let's really get it out there. Come on, what do we know? And and then returning that with some facts and some data and some research and some scientific evidence to really support then, and not over promising. These are all things I think are really helpful for people going into workplaces, particularly them not over promising.
Yeah. Really I think actually, so one more thing I would say is also just a couple of stories that they really relate to, and not necessarily just in the workplace, because I often find that leaders and managers are actually, when it comes down to it, they're more interested in how mindfulness practice might help them as a father, or a member of their family or community, really, than they are at work. And one very brief story I tell from research is a couple of participants who told a story about how stressed they got at work and how they carried that stress back home in their commute. They charged in through the front door, and it took about 2 minutes before everybody in the family was then in a foul, stressed mood. We can all relate to that. We've all done that.
Yeah, we all know that one.
And this ability to, they spoke about the ability to put the key in the keyhole and use that as a trigger moment in which to become aware of what they were about to bring into the family home, and then opening up choice. This is where it links to the habits. This is how you change habits. And it's stories like that. And you can see when leaders are like, oh my God, that totally is meaningful.
Yeah.
So, how do you reach something that really is meaningful to them in this space is important.
Yeah. Yes, I think we can all relate to bringing work things home and the impact that makes. So yeah, I can imagine visualizing the key and making that choice. Beautiful analogy. So maybe we have 5 minutes left, and I know going to be fascinated with this employee activism work that you're doing, and if you've got a couple of minutes to tell us about that, I'd be really delighted to hear about it.
So this came up in our overall project on Speaking Truth to Power, obviously, but has been a real focus over the last year or so. So you've probably seen on the front page of the newspaper organizations grappling with, and usually, to be honest, messing up with issues of wider social and environmental concern. So in the past, I think organizations and leaders have been able to get away with claiming that their organization is somehow apolitical or neutral. And no, we don't go into issues around race or gender particularly, or whatever the government is choosing to do with immigration. That's that's out there in the world. We'll just get on with our job. Well, now that's not possible to really say. One, because organizations are making purpose statements left, right, and center. They're being pressured by ESG, share investors, people looking for wider stakeholder benefit than just shareholder benefit, and this increasing awareness that there is no such thing as being apolitical, because if you don't make a statement on something, that is as much a political act, because you're essentially perpetuating the status quo, as it is to get off the fence and say what you stand for. So there's a number of factors that will make it much more likely that employees will be speaking up and seeking to influence organizational policy and strategy on social and environmental concerns in a way that they haven't done before. And our experience is that leaders and managers, and by the way, I don't mean to separate employee activists from leaders and managers, because leaders and managers may well be employee activists themselves. It's important to say. But I think it's also clear that many managers and leaders find themselves woefully ill prepared to have conversations on what are pretty contentious issues, and facilitating what we call voices of difference. So employee activists are voices of difference that challenge the status quo. And managers and leaders have been trained, broadly speaking, over decades to be in control, in charge, offer certainty, and advocate solutions. Employee activism, it's a bit tricky to know what else organizations can do aside from engaging in dialogue and being able to facilitate difference and share power and be willing to learn and to admit that they don't know. And that's not a habit. Talking about habit, that's not habit for at the moment. So our activism research is examining the experience of activists in the workplace and how they choose how to influence. And it's examining how do leaders and managers respond to activist voices, quite a spectrum of responses, and how they choose those responses as well. And the final thing, because obviously I can't cover it in any depth here, but the one thing I would pick out is, and this is a bit of a habit, and this is where mindfulness comes in, leaders can very easily find themselves in what I call an optimism bubble, which you could also just say that they're deluded, to be honest. As you get more senior, we know that senior people tend to overestimate the degree to which people are speaking up around them. They overestimate their listening skills and how approachable they are, and they underestimate the challenges that other employees have around them. So they enter up in this little bubble, and of course nobody tells them that they're in a bubble because they're quite intimidating and scary. They don't get any feedback either. And then, you know, activist or issues erupt and they don't know how to cope with it. So how do we help leaders to be aware of what I would call their advantage? How do we help them to notice the bubble? And how do we give them the confidence and awareness to reach out, to constructively, curiously engage with difference in the workplace? And all of the, you know, the business case for that, but my goodness, the moral case to do that too.
Yeah. I mean, this is another podcast in its own right. I mean, I'm really interested to hear more about that research and what you're finding. I can sense what's coming up for me as a weight of responsibility for people in the organization to, like you say, to listen up, to allow that safe space for people with very strong views to be able to express those in a way that maybe is not historically been possible in the workplace. But I'm also thinking about all of the things that are happening in the world just now that have, you know, very strong divisive reactions to what's going on, and how, you know, if that divisiveness is brought into the workplace, and you quite rightly, you know, make a safe space for people to express their opinions and views, how a whole new set of skills are required from not just, like you say, leaders, but everybody in the workplace for that to be possible, to remain working in harmony and in safety and productively, but also for people to be able to have these views and to be able to express them. And I think hearing more about how that might be possible and workable from you on a future kind of discussion would be fascinating to be able to do that.
I'm definitely up for that.
Yeah,
Sharon, we can definitely make a date to do that.
Thank you, Megan. before we close, I wonder, is there anywhere we can signpost people to? Because you've spoken a lot about stuff. Obviously, there's the 2 books. Let me just, could you maybe remind us of those? And
Yeah.
might people be able to go and read some of your work or research? Because there's so much in what you've just said, and I know that people want to read some more.
So the 2 books, the most recent book is called Speak Up. That's with Financial Times Publishing. And the other book on our mindfulness work is called Mind Time, written with Michael Chastleton. And far more resources than you could possibly want or imagine are on my website, which is meganreitz.com. And there's a TEDx talk particularly on the leadership traps around creating speak up cultures that you might want to look at. And there's also a lot of articles in Harvard Business Review. You can just go to hbr.org and search up my name, and you'll see quite a few articles on both of the projects that I've been mentioning, and indeed on the activism one that I mentioned just recently as well. Thank you, Megan. Generous sharing both here and on your website. I mean, I know that I'll certainly be going back there to have another look. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you. I've really enjoyed it, Sharon. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.